Well, giving an overview of youth development in 10 minutes is a task, so I'll get right to it. First, I want to start with the definition of youth development that you see on your screen, the positive youth development created by the Interagency Working Group, the Interagency Working Group on Youth Programs. I won't read it to you, but I want you to point out several words that are key. This is an intentional pro-social approach. It focuses on engagement. It focuses on strengths, providing young people with opportunities and supports, and really sort of grounded in relationships. So as you read that definition, let those words pop out because they're going to come up repeatedly as I go through some slides. At the Forum for Youth Investment over the years and even before, I like to draw pictures to help people understand what we mean by youth development. This is one of the first that we drew. We know that addressing youth problems is critical and that we need to get in there early, and prevention is really at the top of that chain of preventing youth problems. But about 30 years ago, I coined the term problem-free isn't fully prepared. And that really started the conversation in some ways about the fact that we can help young people not be pregnant, not use drugs, not be in gangs, but ultimately what we need is to make sure that they are prepared, that they are ready and prepared for college, work, and life, as we talk about now. But even better preparation, while critical isn't sufficient, young people really have to be fully engaged. That should be our goal. In thinking about how to sum up what we know about youth development and provide an overview of the basic principles, I went back to the 2002 report produced by the National Research Council, Community Programs to Promote Youth Development, a really seminal piece that brought together researchers from across disciplines to really sum up the research that we know from youth development, from education, from family studies, and give us a sense of what it really means to promote youth development. There are three takeaways. Everyone should read the book, but there are three takeaways I want to focus on. The first is that the report really affirms that preventing problems and promoting development go hand in hand, that these are dual goals that really are important for the reduction of efforts in the context of promoting development and readiness, that we need to think of these as not separate domains, that some young people go to prevention programs and some young people go to development programs, but that these really go hand in hand. Again, a picture to help you think about that. Especially when we think about programs and funding streams, we chop those up into pieces. And so we have delinquency and violence and HIV and pregnancy and dropout prevention, the range of things that are sort of bites out of that donut. Years ago, when we started to look at programs that were working on these different issues, when you looked at the programs that were effective, what they were doing consistently was providing supports and opportunities. There are those two key words. They weren't just providing services related to the specific problems they were trying to prevent or reduce. They were actually creating supports and opportunities for young people to build strengths, build relationships, and demonstrate their competence. And so over time, our agenda for young people has gone from just a litany of things we don't want them to do to being able to name and define the competencies that we want them to have and the kinds of success they want to have, whether it's civic engagement, it's physical health, it's vocational readiness. So our goals for young people are now moving from the things that we don't want them to do to the things that we do want them to do. And what we know is that if we want to set goals that are more aggressive than just being problem-free, we also then have to change the way we do practice. So takeaway 2 from the report, which I want to emphasize, is that the report really does affirm that while cognitive development is critical, in and of itself it isn't sufficient. It's only one of several developmental domains that we have to pay attention to. This is important because often in this country we talk about education as a success marker, and then the rest of the things that we're reducing are the barriers to education. What the National Research Council did for us was to make sure that we understand that young people need to have positive goals set in physical development, yes, in intellectual development, in psychological and emotional development, and in social development. More recently, if you've heard about social and emotional learning, organizations like the Collaborative for Academic Social and Emotional Learning have really brought more depth and understanding and indicators to these ideas that young people really need to have these competencies that are beyond cognitive skills, content skills, I would call them, and they're around self-awareness, they're around relationships, responsible decision-making, as well as social management. So those broad constructs of skills turn out to be very important, and they are the space that we need to fill between making sure that young people are academically and vocationally successful and making sure that they are reducing problems. Resiliency research basically named these skills more than 30 years ago and told us that those young people who are able to both reduce problems and increase success have these skills, and that those skills can be built if we pay attention to them. So takeaway 3 from the NRC report is that providing effective programming requires attention to program quality and a commitment to a linking infrastructure. That helping young people find these positive experiences can't be happenstance. That when we're thinking about how we build supports for young people in communities and how we build programs, we have to think about how they link together. The main thing that the National Research Council report did for us was to give us a very clear research-based definition of the kinds of supports that need to be in any setting where young people spend their time. Whether that's school, it's a youth organization, it's a recreation program, it's an employment and training program. Young people need to be physically and psychologically safe. They need to have appropriate structures, supportive relationships, opportunities to belong, positive social norms, support for efficacy and mattering, which happens primarily when we have young people not just learn, but practice in ways that make a difference. Opportunities for skill building, and skill building in areas that are of interest to them. And then finally, we need to integrate family, school, and community supports in ways that this feels seamless as young people move through their lives. And that's especially important in adolescence when young people on their own are venturing into different settings and different circumstances. So I've given you a quick overview of the principles of youth development and the kind of supports that we should be providing in community programs and in schools if we're using this PYD approach. And the question you may have is, does it make a difference? When young people have supportive relationships, or they have real opportunities for skill building in areas of interest or chances to practice and put their skills into practice, does that matter? And the answer is yes. So let me take a few more minutes to share the research from Michelle Gambone and Jim Connell done in that same year, 2002. They took several large longitudinal studies of young people between early adolescence and early adulthood, so let's say 14 to 24, more or less. They put those together and did a meta-analysis. The first thing that they did was to really look for thresholds and to figure out what it looked like when young people really were successful. And they identified those 3 broad domains. Young people were successful when they were productive, either academically or vocationally, depending on how old they were. That meant they were in school, they had a job, they were in college, they had a high school degree. They were connected to something larger than themselves. That's a civic organization, a faith organization. They were volunteering, and they were healthy. They were engaged in good health habits, healthy behaviors. They were managing risky behaviors. What they found was with those basic definitions of doing well, only about 4 out of 10 young adults were doing well, with the basic definition that they were doing well in 2 of those categories and doing okay in a 3rd. And it didn't matter which 2. What they found was that doing well clustered together in that way. Conversely, doing poorly meant that you weren't doing well in any of those areas. You were actually at risk. So if you weren't doing well in the productive space, you had dropped out, you were on welfare, you didn't have a job. In that civic space, that connected space, young people were committing illegal activities. So not doing well really meant not doing well. And 2 out of 10 young adults fell into that category. The remaining 4 fell in the middle. So 2 things quickly. The first is that you can ask, well, we're talking about adolescence. When they actually looked at this research and they asked the question, what made a difference? What was the difference between young people who were doing well as young adults and who weren't? And did those things matter? The answer was yes. So let's take relationships. Sort of the cornerstone of youth development is supportive relationships. In adolescence, young people who were entering high school with supportive relationships with peers and adults and had remained in those supportive relationships throughout high school were 5 times more likely to come out of high school ready than those young people who did not have supportive relationships. That's controlling for everything that they could control for. By being ready, that didn't just mean they got a diploma. It meant they came out with a B- average or better. They came out with a sense of where they were going to go next. In that sense, young people who came out of high school ready were then 4 times as likely to be doing well as young adults. 4 times more likely. So introducing relationships, introducing opportunities for skill building, introducing opportunities for contribution had a huge effect on whether young people actually did well as young adults. The bottom line is that, I think I skipped one, but maybe not. Let me go back and see if it's there. Nope. The bottom line is that when young people did well, and when they changed the percentage of young people who were actually getting those supportive skills, we were able to change that picture from 4 in 10 young people doing well to 7 in 10 young people doing well, and from 2 in 10 young people being in trouble to 1. So we couldn't get it all the way up to 100, but you can significantly change the trajectory for young people if we introduce these important components into the places where they spend their time. So as I wrap up, why is that important? It's important because my message is, let's not think of positive youth development as a program. Think of it as, again, that set of supports that have to be in place that allow young people to build those core skills so that they can be successful at preventing or preparing for whatever they want to do. And that means that when we're thinking about PYD as an approach, we can think about it as an approach that's relevant for prevention, all those prevention areas. It's relevant for education, it's relevant for workforce preparation, and it's relevant for those young people who are moving forward out of foster care or juvenile justice. So positive youth development is a very powerful approach, and as we bring it into our programs, we can help young people exponentially change the trajectory of their lives. Thank you.